They called their gods immortal, yet their worship often looked like torment. In the sun-drenched courtyards of ancient Greece, behind marble columns and painted frescoes, pleasure and pain were not opposites. They were intertwined. Men risked honor for desire. Women were forced into rituals that blurred the sacred and the obscene. And all of it was justified in the name of culture, myth, and divine law. These were not secret sins whispered in the dark. They were spectacles, etched into stone and celebrated on festival days. But what did it feel like to live in a world where sex was ritual, punishment, and power all at once? Tonight, we descend into that world, not as voyeurs, but as witnesses. Before we begin, if you're drawn to stories where history strips off its masks, where human nature reveals its darkest cravings and cruelest traditions, then subscribe, leave a like, and join us as we uncover the untold sides of the past. The temple smelled of incense, salt, and sweat. Marble columns rose like frozen trees, holding up a sky painted in red and gold. At dawn, the worshippers gathered, not to kneel, not to pray in silence, but to offer their bodies as vessels for the divine. The goddess Aphrodite, they believed, demanded no blood, no burnt offerings of cattle. She wanted devotion through flesh. And so men and women came forward, coins clinking, voices hushed, waiting for a priestess to take them by the hand and lead them into the chambers where faith became indistinguishable from desire. To the outsider, it seemed obscene. To the Greeks, it was sacred. Union within those walls was thought to bring blessing, fertility for the barren, prosperity for merchants, healing for the sick. A farmer might spend his last drachma for a night with a consecrated woman, convinced that the soil of his fields would yield double the grain. A sailor, about to face the black waves of the Aegean, might press his lips against the neck of a temple attendant and believe the goddess herself now walked with him at sea. But behind the sanctity was something harsher. Many of the women who served were not priestesses by choice. Some were slaves, given as offerings by their master. Others were daughters sold to the temple, their lives decided by the debts of their fathers. To the men who touched them, they were holy, but in the quiet hours, when the lamps were snuffed and the marble floors still glistened with oil and wine, they were simply women trapped in gilded cages. The hymns rising outside masked their silence. Musicians played lyres, their strings ringing high as if the music itself could cleanse what was happening in the shadows. Yet the truth lingered. Religion gave permission for what might otherwise have been condemned. And that permission meant power. The priests grew wealthy, the temples flourished, and the faithful whispered of miracles. But no miracle came for the women who spent their youth in ritual beds, their bodies both sacred and expendable. We often imagine the ancient Greeks as philosophers, dreamers of democracy, poets who carved beauty into stone. And yes, they were all of these things. But beneath the marble and myth was this raw truth. Their gods demanded not just worship, but intimacy. And in the name of those gods, countless lives were consumed. Even myths echoed this logic. When Zeus desired, he took. Disguise was his tool. A bull, a swan, a sudden storm. The stories told that mortals were chosen, blessed to be joined with the divine. But how much of that blessing was simply a mask for power, the same mask worn in the temple chambers of Aphrodite? As torches flickered against the walls, shadows danced across painted scenes of gods and lovers. Each encounter between worshipper and priestess was framed as continuation of myth, a living echo of sacred unions. But myth is cruel in its silence. It tells us nothing of what these women felt. Their voices were swallowed by hymns, their pain hidden beneath incense smoke. Yet there is a darker question. Did the worshippers truly believe? Or did they use belief as justification, eager to taste forbidden sweetness without the burden of guilt? For when the line between faith and desire vanishes, it becomes easy to call indulgence holy. Here, in these temples, sex became sacrifice, not of flesh cut open by knives, but of dignity, youth, and freedom. The marble steps, polished by centuries of feet, bear witness to the weight of devotion and exploitation alike. And if you listen closely, beyond the hymns and lyres, you can almost hear it, the echo of women's footsteps, hesitant, resigned, as they walked toward chambers where the goddess was watching, or perhaps only men in masks of power. The question remains, was this faith, or was it theater? And if it was theater, who wrote the script, the gods or the men who claimed to serve them? Imagine the festival of Aphrodite in Corinth, a city once famed for its towering temple that overlooked the sea. The temple's priestesses were said to number in the hundreds, each dedicated to serving not only the goddess but the steady stream of pilgrims, sailors, and merchants who poured into the city. At dusk, the streets filled with firelight as chants echoed down the stone roads, and one by one, women robed in crimson descended from the temple steps. To the faithful, their presence was divine incarnation. To the women themselves, it was the beginning of another night where worship meant surrendering body and soul to strangers. The rituals varied from city to city. In some, the act itself was offered within sacred chambers, draped in tapestries and perfumed with oils meant to conceal the rawness of what took place. In others, the women were led into designated quarters, while outside, worshippers sang hymns to drown the cries that sometimes escaped. These practices were called hierodulia, sacred servitude, though the word hid more than it revealed. Servitude to whom? To the goddess, or to the men who controlled the temple's wealth. The myths gave legitimacy. They told of gods descending to mortals in moments of passion. Zeus as a bull carrying Europa, Apollo pursuing Daphne until she begged the earth to transform her into a tree, Pan chasing nymphs into caves where their screams mingled with wind. For the Greeks, desire was not a mortal weakness, it was divine will. And if the gods themselves pursued mortals without restraint, then how could men be judged for imitating them? In this way, myth did not simply explain the world, it excused it. Yet myth also carried warnings. Aphrodite herself, though goddess of love, was cruel to those who resisted her. The story of Hippolytus tells of a young man who scorned her worship, devoting himself to Artemis instead. Insulted, Aphrodite cursed his stepmother with unnatural desire, setting in motion a chain of shame, rejection, and death. His fate became a lesson whispered in temples. Deny the goddess, and she will destroy you. Worship through flesh was not optional, it was survival. Beneath this divine mandate were the faces of real women. There are scattered inscriptions, faint records of names etched into stone. Damaris, dedicated to the goddess. Philanes, given to the temple by her father. Each name once belonged to a living soul, each inscription a quiet tombstone for a life consumed by ritual. Some entered willingly, believing service to the goddess would bring honor or protection. But many were simply given, their consent irrelevant, their bodies transformed into offerings no different from grain or cattle. Consider, too, the psychological weight. To be told that every embrace, every touch by a stranger was sacred, not degradation but duty, was both cage and comfort. Some may have clung to the belief that their suffering had purpose, that Aphrodite herself cradled them in invisible arms. Others must have known, deep inside, that it was not gods but men who fed on their youth, their beauty, their tears. What does faith become when it is twisted into justification for chains? The economy thrived. Pilgrims left offerings of gold, merchants donated ships' cargoes, and the temple amassed treasures that rivaled kings. Statues of Aphrodite gleamed with polished ivory and gold leaf, funded by the trade of flesh in her name. To worship was to pay, and the currency was both coin and body. The goddess became not just a figure of love, but the beating heart of a system that consumed countless lives for wealth and spectacle. Still, there were whispers. Some philosophers sneered at the practice, calling it corruption disguised as religion. Others defended it, claiming that desire sanctified by ritual was purer than desire in secret. But none of their words erased the fact that behind every hymn, behind every polished statue, there were tears unseen, lives shortened, voices lost. And so the temple stood, gleaming white against the blue of the Aegean sky, its columns casting long shadows at sunset. Pilgrims continued to climb its steps, coins clutched tight, prayers on their tongues. But in the quiet corners, away from the chants and music, women sat in silence, knowing that when night fell, their bodies would again be taken as offerings. They were praised as sacred in the daylight, but when the doors closed, they were simply prisoners in the service of gods who never bled. This is the tragedy of sacred sex in Greece. It clothed exploitation in holiness, wrapped suffering in incense, and declared that the cries of mortals were the songs of heaven. And whether the gods demanded it, or whether men merely claimed they did, the outcome was the same: countless lives swallowed in the name of devotion. In the city of Delphi, sacredness carried another face. Here, where the oracle spoke in riddles from the mouth of Apollo himself, whispers tell us that priestesses were sometimes forced to endure more than the divine trance. The god's voice was invoked, yes, but so too was the right of men in power to claim what they wished under the cloak of piety. the marble courtyards filled with petitioners seeking prophecy, and in the chaos of devotion, the lines between worship and violation blurred again. A question lingers like smoke. Were the gods ever truly speaking, or were men putting words and hands into their mouths? In Corinth, the spectacle was open, vast, and unapologetic. In smaller towns, it was quieter, hidden behind modest shrines, where a single girl might be bound to a life of service until age stole her beauty. Some cities made temple sex a public festival. Others disguised it as a private obligation owed to the goddess. The scale differed, but the structure was the same. The woman as vessel, the act as offering, the temple as beneficiary. And what of those who resisted? History records little, but silence itself is telling. No carved relief shows a priestess fleeing the marble steps. No hymn preserves the cry of refusal. To resist was to deny the goddess, and to deny the goddess was to risk ruin. Families who had given their daughters would lose honor. Men who had paid coin would rage at betrayal. A priestess who fled might be hunted down not only as a runaway but as a heretic. Her body was property of both God and city, and property does not escape. The myths mirrored these chains with cruel irony. Consider the tale of Cassandra, cursed by Apollo to see the future but never be believed. Her tragedy was not unlike that of countless women in temple service. Voices silenced, truths dismissed, bodies sacrificed for gods who never listened. The Greeks carved her into story, but perhaps she was only a reflection of the forgotten women whose cries rose into the smoke of the altar and vanished, unheard. Even the men who entered the temples paid a hidden price. Some came with trembling hands, convinced that by lying with a priestess they were touching the divine. Others left with shame gnawing at their insides, knowing they had participated in a ritual that was less holy than it was hungry. Faith justified their actions, but belief does not erase doubt. The line between worshiper and sinner blurred until even they could not see it. And still the temples flourished. Wealth flowed in like rivers. Statues of Aphrodite, her marble curves perfect and cold, stood above the women who bled for her. The goddess smiled eternally, carved in stone, while those who bore her name aged, broke, and vanished into the shadows of history. The goddess remained young forever. Her servants never did. There is a cruel beauty in how the Greeks framed this. To them, eros, desire, was as natural as rain, as inevitable as death. To deny it was to deny life itself. And yet, by clothing desire in ritual, by binding it to the name of the goddess, they transformed it into a tool. A woman's body was not her own. It was a key to blessings, a vessel for fortune, a currency of piety. And when she was used up, when her youth was gone, the goddess did not come to save her. She simply faded from the temple, nameless, unrecorded, her body discarded like a burnt offering after the flames died. We will never know how many lived and died in these temples. The stones tell us nothing. The hymns remember only the goddess. But the silence of history is itself a scream. Each step polished by bare feet, each coin offered on marble altars, each festival where men cheered and women wept, they all tell us this truth. In ancient Greece, sacredness could be a mask for suffering. And behind the mask, countless human lives were swallowed whole. So when we stand before the ruins of those temples today, when we run our fingers across the cracked marble and imagine the grandeur of festivals long gone, perhaps we should not only think of beauty. We should hear the echoes of incense, of lyres, of hymns rising into the night, and beneath them, quieter still, the voices of women who were never free to say no. This was the first face of Greece's most bizarre sexual practice. Holiness twisted into hunger, ritual masking exploitation, faith demanding the flesh of mortals. And it is only the beginning of the story. The symposium was not a dinner. It was a performance, a ritual of men bound not by faith in gods but by loyalty to each other, to wine, to conversation, and to desire. Behind the carved wooden doors, oil lamps flickered, casting gold across polished craters filled with dark, spiced wine. Reclining couches lined the walls, each draped with silks, each holding men who styled themselves philosophers, poets, or politicians. Their words flowed as freely as the wine, but beneath the debate of virtue and the riddles of Socrates, another current pulsed, one of hunger, hierarchy, and possession. The Greeks celebrated the symposium as a cornerstone of culture. It was here that men sharpened wit, recited verses, and tested ideas that would one day shape philosophy. Yet alongside those lofty pursuits came something far darker. Boys, young, often barely past childhood, were brought in as companions. Slaves poured wine until their arms ached. Music drifted from the trembling hands of girls forced to play the flute. The symposium was not merely intellectual theater. It was a stage where desire and domination paraded without shame. The relationship between older men and adolescent boys, known as paiderastia, was often framed as mentorship, as if lust could disguise itself as education. To the Greeks, it was tradition. The boy offered beauty and submission, the man offered wisdom and protection. But beneath this poetic veil was a stark imbalance. The boy had no choice. His family might offer him to a powerful man for favor, or he might be singled out and courted under the guise of cultural expectation. Behind every tale of noble mentorship lies the quieter reality of a child with no escape. Wine only deepened the shadows. As the night stretched on, voices grew louder, hands bolder. The symposium blurred philosophy with indulgence until the torchlight revealed not thinkers at the height of civilization but men intoxicated by power. They spoke of justice by day and exercised cruelty by night. And the victims were not only the boys. Women, when present, were rarely equals. Courtesans, concubines, or slaves. Their role was to entertain, to arouse, to absorb the hunger of men who spoke of virtue while ignoring it in practice. A guest might lift a cup of wine and declare that beauty was divine. He might quote Homer, invoking the love of Achilles and Patroclus. But when the cup was set down, the philosophy dissolved, and what remained was the raw spectacle of possession. The symposium became a microcosm of Greek society, pleasure reserved for the powerful, suffering relegated to the powerless. And yet, to step inside one was to feel the intoxicating pull of it. Imagine the sound, laughter echoing against stone, the strum of the lyre vibrating through the air, the soft rhythm of flutes mingling with the splash of wine poured again and again. Imagine the smell, roasted meat, rich spices, the sharp bite of fermented grapes, the faint musk of sweat and perfume mixing into a heady fog. To the men reclining, it was ecstasy. To those serving, it was exhaustion and dread. We are told, in fragments of writing, of boys who became lovers of philosophers, of women praised for their beauty, of slaves whose names are not even recorded. Their anonymity is their legacy, proof that their suffering was routine, expected, unworthy of inscription. In the dim glow of oil lamps, power disguised itself as culture. The Greeks immortalized the symposium in art and poetry, but those paintings on vases, with their elegant figures reclining and drinking, never show the fear in a boy's eyes or the trembling of a slave's hand as wine sloshes over the rim of a cup. The Greeks believed that through desire, men touched the divine. Yet what if desire was only another word for hunger, and hunger always devours? The symposium was not temple ritual. It was not cloaked in hymns or justified by gods. It was justified by culture, tradition, and the unspoken rule that power needs no reason. And in that silence, in the gap between philosophy and practice, countless lives were ground beneath the feet of men who drank deeply and called it civilization. As the night wore on, the symposium often shifted from elegance to chaos. Wine was diluted at first, carefully mixed with water to pace the evening, but soon restraint gave way to indulgence. By midnight, the craters were emptied without care, and the room, once filled with reasoned debate, swelled with drunken laughter and grasping hands. In this haze, philosophy became pretext. What remained was power unmasked. Violence was never far. Ancient writers, while often coy in their descriptions, left us hints of what happened when boundaries dissolved. Boys who resisted advances risked humiliation or beatings. A slave who spilled wine might be punished on the spot, stripped and whipped before the reclining guests. For the men, these acts were entertainment, an extension of the evening's performance. To the victims, they were terror disguised as custom. The symposium was not merely indulgence. It was a theater of dominance where cruelty became spectacle. Greek society cloaked these acts in language of mentorship and beauty, yet myth again revealed the darker truths. The tale of Ganymede was recited often at these feasts. The beautiful Trojan boy abducted by Zeus himself, carried to Olympus as cupbearer of the gods. To the Greeks, this myth was divine justification. If Zeus could take a boy for pleasure, then so could mortal men. What they ignored was the violence beneath the story. An abduction, a boy torn from his family, stripped of his life to serve forever at another's table. The myth was not romance. It was power sanctified. The courtesans and entertainers, too, bore the weight of this culture. Hired for their beauty or skill, they had little choice in how the night unfolded. Some, like the famed Hetera Aspasia, gained influence through wit and connections, but most remained faceless, nameless, their bodies traded as easily as amphorae of wine. These women were praised in the moment, adorned with garlands, kissed as muses of beauty, and discarded when the night ended. Their laughter was currency, their silence expected, and unlike the men they entertained, their names rarely found their way into history. The atmosphere was thick with contradictions. A philosopher might lecture on self-control as he reached for a trembling servant. A poet might sing of virtue while demanding a boy to warm his couch. And no one in the room saw the hypocrisy, because power rewrites morality in its own image. When the strong desire, the act becomes tradition. When the weak suffer, their silence becomes invisible. Outside the symposium halls, the city slept. Women who were not courtesans or slaves remained barred from entry, tucked away in their homes, their virtue guarded, their silence enforced. For them, the symposium was a distant rumor, a place where men became gods of their own making, where rules dissolved under torchlight. But within the walls, every cry, every laugh, every whispered bargain left a scar on those forced to serve. The Greeks painted their symposiums on pottery, black-figured scenes showing men reclining, drinking, playing katabos with flicked dregs of wine. These images, frozen in clay, appear almost playful to us now. But the pottery tells only half the story. What it does not show are the tears of a boy taken against his will, or the bruises on a slave's wrists, or the hollow look in a courtesan's eyes when dawn revealed her exhaustion. History remembers the laughter, not the silence. And yet, even as cruelty coursed through these gatherings, the Greeks elevated them as the pinnacle of culture. They wrote that the symposium refined the soul, bonded men together, inspired poetry and politics. Perhaps it did, but the cost of this refinement was extracted from those who had no voice, no power, and no escape. Here lies the paradox of Greece. The same culture that gave us Plato's dialogues and Aristotle's ethics also gave us nights where wisdom and violence shared the same couch. The same people who dreamed of democracy created feasts where the powerless had no rights at all. And the symposium, glittering in art and poetry, remains as much a monument to domination as to philosophy. So the question lingers, when we celebrate the brilliance of Greek thought, do we forget the bodies left in its shadows? The symposium did not end when the lamps guttered and the guests staggered home. Its echoes seeped into the city itself, shaping how Greeks understood desire, power, and human worth. For those who reclined on couches, drunk on wine and rhetoric, the evening might be remembered as brilliance, as camaraderie, as philosophy made flesh. But for those who served, those who were touched, bruised, or broken, the symposium never ended. It lived in their bodies, in their silence, in the scars left by nights no historian cared to record. Imagine the boy chosen as the beloved. He had no say, no escape. To his peers, he might appear fortunate, taken under the wing of a powerful man, granted gifts, educated in poetry and politics. Yet beneath that sheen of mentorship was a reality he could never confess, that his body had been claimed as part of the bargain. Some grew up to speak proudly of their experiences, reshaping memory into myth. Others carried shadows that could not be voiced, because to name them was to challenge the very pillars of Greek society. The silence of those boys is louder than any poem. And then there were the slaves, whose lives were stripped of even the illusion of choice. For them, the symposium was labor laced with terror. To spill wine, to hesitate, to refuse. Any of these could mean punishment before the eyes of a laughing audience. Their suffering was woven into the entertainment, normalized as if cruelty were a form of art. Some were mutilated for disobedience. Others simply disappeared, their absence unremarked, their lives forgotten as easily as a broken cup tossed aside. Women fared little better. Respectable wives were barred entirely, hidden away in separate quarters of the home. The symposium was not for them. When women appeared, they came as hetairai, educated courtesans, or as entertainers and slaves. A hetera could, at times, wield wit and beauty into influence, as Aspasia of Athens famously did, becoming companion to Pericles and advisor to men of power. But her story is the exception, not the rule. Most women in the symposium were commodities, passed between guests, adorned with garlands one moment and discarded the next. Their beauty bought them attention, but beauty fades, and with it, so too did their worth. The cruelty of the symposium was not only physical, it was psychological, cultural, systemic. By celebrating the domination of the powerless as tradition, it carved a hierarchy deep into the fabric of Greek society. Boys learned that to submit was expected, until one day they themselves would recline on couches and demand submission from another. Slaves learned that their suffering was amusement. Women learned that their worth was conditional, fleeting, expendable. And the men learned that philosophy could excuse almost anything. Myth again reflects this truth. Consider the story of Orpheus, torn apart by Maenads after rejecting women in favor of boys, or the countless tales of gods who demanded submission without consent. These were not fringe stories. They were cultural mirrors, reinforcing the idea that desire was power, and power was destiny. The symposium embodied these myths, replaying them every night under torchlight, as if to prove that mortals and gods were alike in hunger. What remains most haunting is the normalization. No one wrote of these gatherings as crimes. They were not whispered in shame but celebrated in verse, depicted in art, immortalized in philosophy. When Plato wrote of love between men in the symposium, he clothed it in lofty language, but the reality beneath was far less poetic. By idealizing it, by framing domination as beauty, the Greeks etched cruelty into their cultural identity. And once normalized, cruelty becomes invisible. Today, when we marvel at Greek democracy, at the sharp minds of Socrates and Aristotle, at the beauty of their pottery and sculpture, we must remember what lay behind the marble. For every toast raised to wisdom, a slave bore the weight of the cup. For every ode to beauty, a boy endured what could not be refused. For every garland placed upon a courtesan's hair, there was a night when her laughter was forced and her soul unseen. The symposium gave Greece its songs, its poetry, its philosophy, but it also gave it silence, the silence of those crushed beneath its rituals. And that silence is as much a legacy as the words of Plato or the verses of Pindar. This is what it means to look into the heart of the symposium, to see not only the brilliance of Greek thought, but the shadows it refused to acknowledge. Shadows that, like wine stains on marble floors, never truly fade. Pleasure in ancient Greece carried a hidden cost. To desire was human, but to desire wrongly, across boundaries of law, marriage, or social order, was to invite ruin. The very culture that glorified beauty and appetite also demanded harsh retribution when those appetites broke the rules. What emerged was a paradox, a society that celebrated lust in its myths and rituals, but punished its citizens for acting beyond their prescribed roles. Behind the laughter of symposia and the hymns of the temples lay the terror of exposure, of shame, of pain waiting in the shadows. Adultery was the most dangerous of transgressions. A man caught with another's wife could be killed on the spot, his blood spilled in the name of honor. Greek law gave husbands the right, even the duty, to exact vengeance. Some chose execution by blade. Others chose humiliation more cruel than death. A common punishment was raphinidosis, the adulterer bound in the public square, his body forced to endure the thrust of a radish or worse, the insertion of sharp objects, the act both painful and degrading. It was not enough to kill. The offender had to be marked with shame. His suffering turned into a warning to all who watched. For women, the punishment was subtler but no less devastating. A wife caught in adultery could be cast out of her home, stripped of her dowry, branded as polluted. Some were forced into prostitution, their disgrace visible for all to see. A man's honor could be cleansed by blood. A woman's shame was permanent. Her body became a living reminder of transgression, an exile from respectability. In the eyes of society, her sin was not just betrayal, it was contamination. Even myth dripped with this logic of punishment. Consider Actaeon, the hunter who stumbled upon Artemis bathing. His crime was only a glance, but it was enough to seal his fate. The goddess transformed him into a stag, and his own hounds tore him apart. The story whispered a warning. Desire unrestrained, even by accident, was dangerous. Or think of Pasiphae, cursed to lust after a bull, forced into an act that birthed the Minotaur. Her punishment was grotesque, eternalized in myth so that future generations would hear the lesson. Desire can be monstrous, and the body can be turned into its own prison. Punishment extended beyond sexual acts. Effeminacy in men was mocked as weakness, a betrayal of masculinity. In Athens, men accused of being passive partners in love could be barred from public office, their reputations shredded. To desire was acceptable, but to desire in the wrong role was to forfeit honor. Pleasure was not free. It was regulated by invisible borders drawn in cruelty and shame. And then there was the ultimate punishment: death by stoning, drowning, or exile for those whose passions were deemed too dangerous to society. These acts were rare, but their possibility lingered over every forbidden glance, every whispered tryst. Fear itself became a form of control, binding people as tightly as chains. But perhaps the cruelest punishment was not physical. It was the weight of silence. Those who suffered exploitation in temples or symposia had no voice to cry out, no law to protect them. Their pain was not punished because it was not seen as crime at all. Instead, their lives bore the opposite fate: invisibility. And invisibility is its own prison. The Greeks built their cities in marble, their words in poetry, their laws in stone. Yet in the cracks of that marble, in the shadows of those words, lived the victims of desire, punished or erased. Their stories are faint, scattered fragments, but together they paint a picture of a society that both worshipped and feared the flesh. Pleasure could bring honor, wealth, and blessing, but step beyond the prescribed lines, and the body became the site of spectacle, punishment, and shame. The question is, did the Greeks fear desire itself, or did they fear losing control over it? And if control demanded cruelty, did they ever pause to wonder whether the gods who demanded these punishments were only reflections of themselves? If punishment was the body's reckoning, then shame was the soul's cage. In ancient Greece, humiliation was not just collateral damage, it was the point. To be punished privately was one thing, but to be exposed before the eyes of neighbors, rivals, and kin was the truest sentence. The Greeks understood that memory lingers in the crowd's laughter longer than in scars upon the skin. One of the most grotesque forms of public shame was not the physical pain itself, but the forced visibility of it. An adulterer dragged through the agora, beaten and jeered, was not simply enduring pain. He was being transformed into a story. The spectacle itself was punishment, and every onlooker carried that story back into their homes. It was as though the crime continued to unfold endlessly, retold in whispers, in tavern banter, in the cruel smirks of children pointing at the disgraced man in the street. A single act of desire became an unending stain, and yet the cruelest punishments often took the form of mockery rather than mutilation. Caricature was a weapon sharper than any blade. In comedies staged in Athens, adulterers, effeminate men, or prostitutes might appear as buffoonish characters, laughed at by audiences of thousands. To be turned into a joke on stage was as binding as a sentence carved in stone. After all, once laughter fixed you in place, there was no return to dignity. A man mocked for weakness in love could never again walk through the city without carrying that invisible mask. The myths, too, reinforced this culture of shame. Think of Hephaestus, the god of the forge, who discovered his wife Aphrodite in bed with Ares. His revenge was not death but humiliation. He cast a net of unbreakable chains, binding the lovers together naked and exposed, then summoned the gods to witness their disgrace. No blood was spilled, no life ended. Yet the punishment lingered in the eternal shame of being trapped and displayed. This was a lesson not only for gods but for mortals. Exposure was worse than death. In this world, even the rituals of festivals contained shadows of humiliation. During certain fertility rites, men would dress as women, their bodies parroted, their voices mocked. These performances blurred lines between devotion and ridicule, leaving one to wonder, was the ritual sacred? Or was it simply society's way of reinforcing who belonged in power and who did not? Behind the mask of celebration lay the reminder that deviation from norms was tolerated only when wrapped in ritual, and only temporarily. Outside those bounds, the same act became sin. Shame was also embedded in silence. For women, the greatest punishment was invisibility, to be banished from conversation, from community, from memory. A wife caught in betrayal could not defend herself publicly. A prostitute used and discarded had no voice in the courts. Even the victims of violence, slaves, temple servants, children, carried their wounds in silence, for their suffering was not considered a crime but an inevitability. To live unseen was its own form of degradation, a punishment without end. The Greeks feared shame more than they feared pain. Pain ended with the body's endurance or the body's death, but shame endured. It echoed in gossip, in plays, in stone inscriptions, in myth retold across generations. It was not just a punishment for the individual but a warning to the entire city. Each spectacle of humiliation whispered the same message: indulge desire, but do not cross the invisible line. The line belonged to men, to husbands, to fathers, to gods. And once you crossed it, you belonged no longer to yourself, but to their ridicule. What makes this even more haunting is how deeply shame was weaponized within intimacy itself. A husband might forgive his wife's trespass not out of mercy, but because exposing her would taint his own honor. A lover might endure mockery in silence, choosing humiliation over exile. Shame dictated choices, steering lives more than law ever could. Law punished the act, shame punished the soul. And here lies the paradox. Greece celebrated beauty, desire, and passion in art, in poetry, in the marble of its statues. Yet it bound its people in fear of exposure, humiliation, and disgrace. It exalted pleasure but chained it with cruelty. Desire was both sacred and dangerous, divine and damnable. To live in Greece was to walk a line between ecstasy and ruin, a line drawn not on the ground, but in the eyes of others. So we must ask, when the Greeks punished so harshly those who strayed, was it truly morality they were protecting? Or was it something far more fragile: reputation, control, the illusion that order could contain the wildness of human desire? The human body was not merely private in ancient Greece, it was political. To the Greeks, the city was a living organism, and its order was mirrored in the discipline of flesh. The body was a site of pleasure, yes, but also a battlefield where power, hierarchy, and morality were enforced. Who touched whom, who lay with whom, who was permitted to desire and who was condemned. These were not just personal choices. They were decisions that determined the strength of a polis, the purity of a bloodline, the stability of the god's favor. Athens, the jewel of democracy, was a city obsessed with appearances, and nothing revealed the truth of a man more than the conduct of his body. The symposium was more than a drinking party. It was an arena where reputations were made or destroyed. A man who drank too greedily, who lusted too openly, who surrendered to pleasure without restraint revealed himself as unfit for leadership. The ideal citizen was expected to master his body as he mastered his household and, by extension, his city. Discipline was not an abstract virtue. It was a visible code, written on the skin, in gestures, in appetites carefully contained. But this obsession with bodily order was not limited to men. Women, too, were seen as reflections of the city's health. Their bodies symbolized both fertility and danger. A wife who bore strong sons strengthened the polis. A wife who strayed threatened not just her household but the legitimacy of inheritance, the very bloodlines upon which citizenship was built. To control women's sexuality, then, was to control the future of the city itself. The guardianship of female desire was framed not as cruelty, but as civic duty. Sparta, by contrast, offers us a harsher mirror. Where Athens veiled its women in the home, Sparta gave them a strange and unsettling freedom. Spartan girls trained in athletics, their bodies hardened like their brothers, and their marriages were orchestrated to produce warriors. Yet even here, sexuality was not free but bound to the city's destiny. A Spartan woman might mock a cowardly husband or reject a weak suitor, but her autonomy was sharpened into a tool. She existed to bear sons strong enough to die for Sparta. Her body was celebrated, yes, but as an extension of the state, not as her own. The Greeks also projected this logic onto their myths. The body of Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world, became the spark of war, her abduction or escape reshaping the destiny of nations. Her beauty was not hers to own. It belonged to Greece, to Troy, to history itself. Similarly, Persephone's abduction into the underworld was not framed as an individual tragedy, but as a cosmic shift, a myth explaining the seasons. Here again, a woman's body was both battleground and prize, her desire erased beneath the needs of gods and men. Even male sexuality was weaponized for civic control. The Eros Ceraminos relationships of Athens, often idealized as mentorship, were also part of a larger political training. To be courted was to be tested. To yield too eagerly, to remain passive beyond youth, was to risk exclusion from citizenship. A man's honor was defined by his role in pleasure, just as the city's honor was defined by its order. Sex was never merely sex. It was a lesson, a hierarchy, a ritual of discipline that extended from bedchamber to battlefield. And in the rituals of religion, the body became the city's offering to the divine. The orgiastic rites of Dionysus, where citizens surrendered to frenzy, were not random indulgences. They were controlled releases carefully sanctioned by the state. To dance wildly, to drink deeply, to blur the boundaries of self was to affirm the city's unity. Even madness was political when it was performed under the gaze of the polis. The gods demanded ecstasy, yes, but always within the framework of order. The Greeks carved marble statues of perfect bodies, yet these figures were not celebrations of individual freedom. They were ideals, impossible and cold, reminders of how flesh should be. The city measured itself through these bodies, judged its citizens by how closely they approached this perfection. To fall short was to risk ridicule, exclusion, or worse. In this way, the Greek body was never free. It was a vessel of duty, a symbol of honor, a reflection of power. The pleasures it sought, the pains it endured, the punishments it risked, all were tied to the survival and pride of the polis. The city owned the body as much as the soul. And yet, beneath this veneer of order, desire still burned. Lovers still defied conventions, slaves still found stolen moments, women still whispered secrets in the dark. The city could claim the body, but it could never fully tame the heart. That was the danger and the tragedy that haunted Greek society. Sex in Greece was never purely private. It rippled outward, shaping politics, reinforcing hierarchies, and legitimizing authority. Leaders understood that control over desire was control over society itself. The same city-states that celebrated art, poetry, and democracy also weaponized sexuality, turning bodies into instruments of political theater. A well-placed rumor, a scandalous affair, or a public transgression could topple reputations faster than any army. To the Greeks, honor and desire were inseparable. One's sexual conduct could validate power or destroy it. Consider Athens during times of political tension. A politician accused of effeminacy or of indulging too freely in forbidden pleasures could be ostracized, his career ended. Conversely, mastery over desire, disciplined love, carefully cultivated relationships, and public restraint became a measure of leadership. The erotic was political. To be desired or to control desire was to assert dominance. The symposium and temple rituals were more than private indulgence. They were rehearsals for the city's stage, where power, persuasion, and control were practiced in the body before being exercised in the assembly. Sexual imagery also dominated propaganda. Vases, mosaics, and frescoes often depicted gods taking mortals or mortals serving gods, reinforcing the naturalization of power through desire. Helen of Troy, drawn across city walls in painted panels, reminded citizens that beauty could ignite war. Even the abduction of Persephone was displayed in temple reliefs, not as a cautionary tale, but as a moral lesson on obedience, hierarchy, and the consequences of transgression. Myth became the city's shorthand for social order. The body was never just flesh, but a symbol of civic virtue or disaster. The weaponization of sexuality extended to diplomacy. Marriages, betrothals, and sexual alliances were tools of influence. A city could secure loyalty, wealth, or military advantage by arranging unions that were political as much as personal. Women were central to this system. Their fertility, beauty, and presence became the currency through which cities negotiated power. A king's daughter married strategically, a concubine presented to curry favor, a hetaira employed to seduce foreign envoys. These were not anomalies but deliberate strategies. The human body, in the Greek imagination, was as valuable as land, gold, or armies. Even military discipline had erotic dimensions. The bond between Erastes and Ereminos was celebrated not only as mentorship, but as a method to instill loyalty, courage, and obedience. Warriors' love for each other, framed as virtue, strengthened armies and reinforced social cohesion. Desire, framed correctly, became both moral and functional, a means of shaping citizens who would defend the polis with both body and soul. Sex and power were intertwined. The erotic was civic. But there was tension beneath this careful orchestration. Desire could never be fully contained. Lovers betrayed city-sanctioned roles. Women resisted, hid, or rebelled. Boys rejected their Eras. Slaves found forbidden pleasures. These breaches were reminders of the fragile line between order and chaos. When desire escaped the state's control, it became scandal, propaganda fodder, and cautionary tale. Public trials, comic ridicule, and myth all served to restore equilibrium, using shame as the city's corrective tool. In essence, the city breathed through its citizens' bodies. Morality, honor, and obedience were enforced not only through law but through ritualized sexual conduct. Temples, symposiums, festivals, and myths all converged to produce a society where eroticism was inseparable from power. Desire was celebrated, but only insofar as it served the polis. Individual autonomy was secondary, often erased. Pleasure was a civic duty, punishment a civic warning. And the body, like the marble streets and temples themselves, belonged to the city. Even today, the ruins whisper these lessons. Marble statues, theater masks, and painted vases are silent witnesses to a culture that intertwined eroticism, governance, and myth. The Greeks perfected the illusion that desire could be tamed, that bodies could be disciplined for the sake of society, and that pleasure itself could be folded into the machinery of power. Yet in every shadowed corner, in every whispered transgression, we glimpse the human cost, the lives constrained, the voices silenced, the suffering ignored. Civilization, the Greeks remind us, is always built on both brilliance and cruelty. The temples have crumbled, the symposium halls lie silent, and yet the legacy of Greek desire refuses to fade. Marble statues gleam in museums, vases whisper stories in muted tones, and myths, retold endlessly, carry shadows of bodies used, violated, and celebrated. The Greeks understood, perhaps better than any civilization before them, that sexuality is never merely private. It is a language of power, a currency of influence, and a mirror for the human soul. Their obsession with desire, with control, with pleasure and punishment, shaped not only their cities but the imagination of every culture that would follow. Consider the Renaissance, when scholars rediscovered Plato and the poets of Greece. The erotic ideals, the myths of gods taking mortals, the beauty of the male and female form, all were revived and celebrated. Artists like Botticelli, Titian, and Michelangelo drew from the Greek obsession with desire, crafting images that were at once divine and intimate, holy and dangerous. Yet the Renaissance inherited not only the art, but the contradictions, the celebration of beauty alongside a subtle insistence on control and hierarchy, echoing the same tension between pleasure and regulation that haunted Athens and Sparta. Even modern psychology and literature carry the imprint. Freud, though centuries later, examined desire, repression, and the conflicts between social norms and human appetite, often drawing explicitly on Greek myths. The stories of abduction, forbidden love, and punishment resonate in novels, plays, and films. The idea that passion is irresistible, dangerous, and often destructive. The Greeks were the first to codify these contradictions, to turn desire into myth and morality, into spectacle and education, into both a blessing and a curse. Political power, too, bears the imprint of their sexual imagination. Leaders' private lives remain a focus of scrutiny. Scandals, affairs, and betrayals are weapons in public arenas, a reflection of the ancient understanding that the control of bodies is inseparable from control of society. The state may have changed its methods, but the principle remains. Desire, exposure, and shame are political tools. In this, the Greeks set the template, consciously or unconsciously, for how culture would intertwine lust and power for millennia. And what of the individuals whose lives were sacrificed to these systems? Their suffering, largely invisible in the historical record, continues to haunt our reading of antiquity. The young boys at symposia, the women in temples, the slaves and courtesans whose voices were erased, their stories linger in absence, in gaps between marble and myth. We can imagine the fear, the hope, the fleeting moments of pleasure or defiance, but mostly we see the outlines. A culture that demanded beauty, obedience, and performance, punishing those who fell short and celebrating those who performed the illusion flawlessly. In art and scholarship, we often romanticize the Greeks. We speak of democracy, philosophy, and literature with awe. But if we look closely, we find something more complex, darker. A civilization that codified sexual exploitation as ritual, that turned desire into pedagogy and punishment into spectacle. They taught the world that pleasure is intertwined with power, and that power, unchecked, inevitably preys upon the vulnerable. That lesson echoes far beyond the Aegean, shaping ethics, art, law, and culture in ways we are only beginning to understand. Yet there is a strange duality here. Greek sexuality, with all its cruelty and calculation, was also a testament to the human longing for transcendence. To lie in the temple, to recline at a symposium, to be immortalized in myth, these acts were attempts to touch something beyond mortality, to turn fleeting desire into permanence. The contradiction is palpable, suffering and ecstasy entwined, shame and glory inseparable. And perhaps it is this tension that has ensured the survival of these stories, making them timeless, compelling, and endlessly instructive. To study Greek desire is to confront the full spectrum of humanity, our longing, our cruelty, our artistry, and our obsession with legacy itself. It is to see how pleasure can become pedagogy, how myth can enforce morality, and how even the most intimate acts of the body can reverberate across centuries. The Greeks left behind a civilization built on beauty and brutality alike, and in their stories, we recognize both ourselves and our history, seduced, punished, and ultimately fascinated by the complexity of desire. Even now, thousands of years later, the echoes of Greek obsession with desire reverberate. The lessons are uncomfortable. Beauty, lust, and power are intertwined, and when unchecked, they consume the vulnerable. The temples, the symposium halls, the marble streets of Athens and Corinth, all of it reminds us that culture can sanctify cruelty, that devotion can mask exploitation, and that stories we romanticize often carry shadows we fail to acknowledge. The myths themselves are cautionary tales. Helen's face launched 1,000 ships, yet she had no agency. Persephone was abducted and reshaped by forces beyond her control. Ganymede was stolen by Zeus and immortalized as beauty and status, his suffering erased by myth. Each story preserves the allure of desire while hiding its human cost, teaching generations that pleasure is both sacred and dangerous. Greek culture did not merely reflect desire, it codified it, directing it toward public spectacle, political control, and moral instruction. This duality is the Greeks' enduring gift and their haunting legacy. They created ideals of beauty, intellect, and love that continue to shape art, philosophy, and thought. Yet they also created hierarchies and systems that normalized the suffering of the powerless. Their civilization reminds us that genius and cruelty can coexist, that admiration and exploitation can intertwine, and that the human body has always been a site of both worship and domination. The tragic cost of desire is also the story of those erased from history. Countless boys, women, and slaves lived and suffered in ways that will never be fully known. Their silence fills the spaces between marble statues, between verses of poetry, between the carefully curated myths that celebrate gods and heroes. In imagining them, we glimpse the human price behind civilization's achievements, the unseen lives that sustained the illusion of order, beauty, and divine favor. Yet even in that suffering, there is testimony to resilience. The stolen boy, the courtesan, the temple servant, they were forced into roles not of their choosing, yet they survived, they witnessed, and in some ways, their endurance persists in every retelling. History may have ignored their voices, but the pattern of power, desire, and human cost is clear, and our acknowledgement of it keeps their memory alive. In the tension between admiration for Greek achievements and recognition of its cruelty lies the most compelling lesson. Human creativity, passion, and intellect thrive alongside vulnerability, exploitation, and suffering. And so the story of Greek sexuality is not merely one of scandal or sensation. It is a study of civilization itself, how desire shapes culture, how power enforces boundaries, and how the human body becomes both vessel and weapon. Every symposium, every temple, every myth preserved a lesson in the fragility of autonomy, the seduction of beauty, and the consequences of violating societal expectation. The Greeks offer us a mirror to admire, to warn, and to reflect upon our own society's entanglement with lust, hierarchy, and morality. Ultimately, the legacy of desire in Greece is timeless because it is universal. Power exploits, beauty commands, pleasure entices, and society sanctions. The temples, the halls, and the myths are gone, but the human truths remain. Desire remains a double-edged force, capable of inspiration and destruction, of divine ecstasy and earthly suffering. The Greeks may have carved the lessons in marble, written them in poetry, and immortalized them in myth, but it is up to us to read between the lines, to see both the brilliance and the tragedy, the beauty and the cost. And in that recognition, perhaps, lies the final understanding that civilization is never only heroic. It is always human, radiant, brutal, flawed, and deeply alive. Desire may seduce, power may corrupt, and myths may enchant, but the human heart, forever caught in between, is what endures.